All right, so my name is John Sherwood. I'm the lead minister here in the Asheville Church. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us this morning. If you're new or if you've been around the Asheville Church family for a long time, we're so grateful to be together in these very strange and difficult times. And so, what we're doing right now is we are actually closing out a year-long series, the 2020 Year of the Bible, finding our place in God's story. And we're ending the year here in the book of Revelation. And so I want to invite you, if you haven't already, join our reading plan. You can jump in on the day that we're on right now. We've been seeking to read the Bible in a year this year together as a church family. It's been really encouraging, lots of great things as we're all learning and growing and allowing God's word to dwell in us richly. And so the first half of this Revelation portion has been about helping us to frame how we read the book of Revelation, which is often very confusing, wild, imaginative, and challenging. And then the last half of this book of Revelation, next month, we're going to spend some time talking about some of the themes in particular and how they are relevant and able to be applied for us today. So we're ending our sort of section on helping us learn how to read this book. So if you hadn't had a chance, I encourage you to take a look at the last two sermons that we started in Revelation that are up on the website. And so far, we've talked about this idea of recanonizing Revelation, how we can treat the book of Revelation as an inspired word of God, a part of the canon, rather than for some of us, we kind of tend to ignore it, don't really read it much, or when we do, we don't know what to do with it. And then also, we've talked about last Sunday what an apocalypse is in the original language here in the scriptures, and how it's very different than the concept that we think of in our modern English translation and understanding of the word apocalypse, and some tips on how we can read apocalyptic literature, which is the nature and the genre of the literature of Revelation. And we talked last week a little bit about how the genre of Revelation, primarily being apocalyptic literature, is also a hybrid genre consisting of not only apocalypse, but also prophecy and epistle or letter as well. And so today, what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about the background and history of the book of Revelation. And we talked a little bit last week about some basic things, who wrote it, when it was written, etc. And now I want to talk about the history of how have people historically viewed and interpreted Revelation? How did it make its way into the Bible in the first place? And so what we have in our Bible is considered the canon. And canon is actually a Greek word that just means rule, or like a measuring stick, something in which something is judged by. And so our Bible is considered the canon. And this is the authoritative books that have been deemed to be from divine origin. And for more on how the canon was formed and how did these books get into the canon and others not, etc., you can take a look at the free class on my website, johnsherwood.com, called How to Read the Bible, where we go into some of this some more. But when we're considering what types of writings go into the canon, we want to look at the early leaders of the churches of Jesus. They wanted to know that the writings that they were looking at and that they would consider authoritative for faith and life of the Christian community, the things that they were looking for are things like, is it ancient? Meaning, is it have connection in its origin to the first generation of Jesus and his disciples? Was it apostolic? Meaning, did it have connection to the original apostles of Jesus? Was it acknowledged throughout the Christian churches? Was there a wide acknowledgement from many Christian communities that recognize this as a part of the canon and, to be authoritative for faith and life of the Christian community? And were they theologically orthodox? Did they teach things that were orthodox and in line with other writings of that time? So early on, actually, the book of Revelation was considered to be part of the Christian canon, but those things started to be really kind of debated and wrestled through, revolving in particular around a hermeneutical question, which is, how do we read it? How do we understand it? Do we take the text of Revelation to be literal or symbolic or allegorical? And so quickly, even though Revelation was considered to be an inspired writing of God, quickly people began to struggle with how do we interpret it. And so that actually created debate on whether or not it should be in the canon. And even though the book of Revelation was relatively debated fairly early on in its history. One scholar has said that Revelation made it into the canon by the skin of its teeth. But once the book of Revelation was widely accepted as a part of the canon of Scripture, that actually exacerbated the interpretive difficulty because now Christians couldn't just ignore Revelation, but had to interpret it, and they had to integrate it with the rest of Scripture because it was a part of the inspired canon. So you could see how it'd be easier to kind of dismiss Revelation if it was like a part of the Apocrypha or just another writing that wasn't inspired. But once it was widely accepted as a part of the inspired canon of God, that actually made the process of interpretation more difficult because it is a difficult and challenging book to interpret. So what does this mean for us today? It means that first and foremost, we are not alone in our struggle to interpret Revelation. So please don't get discouraged if you read it for the first time or the fifth time or the 50th time, and there's still some things that are hard to understand. That goes all the way back to early in the book's history. But it is theologically irresponsible for us to avoid the book of Revelation. And I feel and fear that for many of us, that's what we functionally end up doing. We would never say that it's not a part of the Bible or a part of God's revealed will and word for our lives, but functionally we tend to ignore it and sort of don't know what to do with it. And I think that that can be theologically irresponsible. So let's continue to fight to engage, even if it's challenging, even if we don't always know what things mean or what to do with them. Let's keep struggling through together. So I want to talk a little bit today about some interpretive strategies that we have available to us and some interpretive strategies that have been used throughout history on how we read the book of Revelation. And if you're not familiar with some of this language, words like hermeneutic, it just means how we interpret the scriptures, the way in which we frame how to understand what the Bible means when it says something. That's called a hermeneutic or a hermeneutical approach. And so we're going to talk about some of these types of things today. I want to talk about 5 primary interpretive strategies. I'm sure there are more, but I'll talk about 5 in particular. And all of this is borrowing heavily from Gorman's book, Reading Revelation Responsibly. If you haven't had a chance to check that out or want to know more about a recommended resources list, go check out the other 2 classes where I talk about those. So the first approach that I want to discuss is probably the most common approach to Revelation. And this is called the predictive approach, where it focuses on the future. It focuses on Revelation being about the future and predicting things that are going to happen in the future. This kind of approach is not recent, however. It's had a long history, going all the way back to some of the earliest interpreters of Revelation, such as Justin Martyr and Irenaeus in the 2nd century. So just a generation or 2 or 3 after Revelation was written, we already have people struggling to interpret it and interpreting it through this predictive framework. This kind of predictive approach tends to see Revelation as a set of code that needs to be deciphered and cracked, like a Rubik's Cube. If I can just turn it and twist it just the right way, it'll all line up and make predictions of the future. And history is littered with failed attempts to use Revelation to predict the future. All the time, in our modern context and for contexts predating us, people have used Revelation to predict all kinds of events, the future cataclysmic events of the world, only for their predictions to be proved false. This has happened all the time using this kind of interpretive approach for Revelation. In the predictive approach, people tend to focus on whether or either Revelation predicting world and or church history or on eschatology, which sees Revelation primarily focused on the end times. Eschatology is just a big fancy theological word referring to the end times. And so this approach tends to be interested in connecting the symbols in the book of Revelation with later figures and events in world and church history, especially ones that tend to be happening in the times of the interpreter. For instance, Hal Lindsey, who wrote the famous book, The Late Great Planet Earth, a generation ago, he suggested that the locusts in Revelation chapter 9 were actually modern day attack helicopters of his day. This is a predictive approach, interpretive approach to Revelation. And it should be noted that this type of interpretive approach, it tends to be highly political. And at times, this approach in our day has directly influenced political strategy, as sometimes is the case with US relations with countries, in particular in the Middle East. The second type of approach I want to talk about is called a preterist approach. Preterist is just a word meaning past or past tense. And this approach tends to focus exclusively on the past. In other words, everything in Revelation was meant only for the audience that it was written to in the first century, and that all of the predictions in Revelation happened in the first century. And it should be noted that this type of approach, this preterist or past approach, it developed largely in part as a reaction to the predictive approach that we just talked about. And this preterist approach is also a decoding approach, a Rubik's Cube approach that looks to find meaning in symbols and visions exclusively in the first century. The next three approaches that I want to talk about, they don't see the book of Revelation specifically as a code that needs to be deciphered and cracked for the future or the past, but rather views the book as a lens with a timeless character. And what I mean by timeless is that it will always be able to speak as powerfully and pointedly in later contexts as it did in its original one. What I mean by timeless is that the book of Revelation has a timeless ability to speak into every context in every generation. And so these next three interpretive strategies view this in this kind of timeless lens sort of way, rather than a specific code or decoding kind of way. And one of these interpretive strategies is called poetic or theopoetic, a theo just meaning God. And this approach tends to focus on or contend that Revelation uses mythical and poetic language to express great truths about God and evil and history and so on. And this approach rejects decoding as an approach because it violates the genre and language of Revelation. And it argues that the importance and truth of Revelation is not limited to the past of Rome in the first century or to its alleged correlation with specific future events in our generation or any generation to come. And then there's a political or a theopolitical approach and interpretive strategy to the book of Revelation. And this does not specifically refer to political implications like the predictive or futurist interpretation strategy does, but rather a view that Revelation is a document to comfort and especially protest against the political realms that any generation finds themselves in. Even in our context, Dr. Martin Luther King, he turned to Revelation many times for inspiration to his letter from a Birmingham jail, which I actually just read this year. And unfortunately, as you read Letter from a Birmingham Jail from Dr. King, it still reads like it could have been written last week. And so this theopolitical approach focuses on criticizing injustice, promoting transformation and justice. And we obviously have seen a resurgence of this type of paradigm in our culture in a big way this past year. And I would offer, as I have in many of my other sermons and lectures, that Revelation does a lot of that, as does many other scriptures throughout the canon. And then this last approach that I want to talk about is called a pastoral or prophetic approach. And this approach views Revelation primarily as a document of Christian formation that's designed to call the church to faithfulness in the face of inevitable conflict with hostile powers in every generation. And one scholar, Talbert, says, Revelation functions in the interests of spiritual purity, single-minded devotion to God, or first commandment faithfulness, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your strength, and with all your soul, going all the way back to the Shema. So, as we have these 5 interpretive strategies, which are 5 primary ones that I want to talk about. Obviously, there could be others, but I think that these 5 give us a broad view and a spectrum of how to view Revelation. I want to visually represent these interpretive strategies on a grid. And so this grid is a diagram that hopefully can help us visualize these different types of interpretive approaches. And it's important to note that each of these interpretive approaches, they have value and they have benefit. Each of these approaches offers something that is needed. What I want to talk about is on this vertical axis, we have the present, the past, and the future. So it's kind of like a time axis. And then on the horizontal axis, we have one side viewing Revelation as code that needs to be deciphered and cracked, the Rubik's Cube, if you will. And on the other, we have the idea of viewing Revelation as a lens or like a set of glasses in which to view all of reality, past, present, and future. And so as we discussed, this predictive and preterist views tend to see things as code, whether in reference to the future or to the past. And I didn't really know how to visually represent this on the grid, but the pastoral, prophetic, poetic, and political interpretive frameworks tend to view Revelation as a lens, a set of glasses in which to see all of reality. And really, they do it all throughout past, present, and the future. So really, these three dots could all just kind of be here, here, and here simultaneously, if that makes sense. And while reading Revelation can be difficult to interpret, genuine Christians, sincere lovers of God throughout history have approached the book differently from one another. And I want to suggest that viewing Revelation as a lens, as we see here, as opposed to a code, is actually a more helpful and I believe faithful interpretive approach to the book of Revelation. Without ignoring the past or the future in a general sense, the book of Revelation is always a word to the church in the present. And this is what it means to see it as a lens. These three approaches that we have here, the pastoral, prophetic, poetic, and political, are similar to one another in that they go beyond a mere correspondence or this for that, a code that this means that and that alone, rather to a more timeless concern about God, evil, empire, civil religion, etc. And so in these approaches, in contemporary interpretation of Revelation for us today, we can stay grounded by not making ridiculous futurist predictions, but by recognizing that it is a message for the first century in the past. So the Bible can never mean what it never meant. While we look for contemporary analogies to first century realities, we always keep an eye on the promises of God for the future and of God's creation. Especially we see this at the end of the book of Revelation, chapter 21 and 22. So this kind of lens approach, I think, tends to create a faithful way in which we can view Revelation as relevant for the past in its circumstances and its first century audience. And by understanding that context, we now can faithfully apply those principles, truths, themes to our own context. And although the meaning of Revelation should never be limited to being significant only in the first century, as some preterist views would say, but instead that we would understand and build that first it's critical to understand that context in order for us to responsibly interpret it today. So I want to talk about a few interpretive mistakes and antidotes when we tend to read Revelation. And again, these first three classes are actually just trying to help us frame how to read the book. We're not actually going through line by line, chapter by chapter. I'm not exegeting the book of Revelation just to repeat what I did in the introductory class. But I want to help us have some frameworks and some ways in which we can understand reading Revelation. And for some of us, this is brand new. For some of us, it's not. But I think that these kinds of things are helpful for us as we engage. And just to reiterate and remind from some previous classes, one of the best things that we can do to learn how to read Revelation well is read it a lot and read it in one sitting or as few sittings as possible, to be able to take in the message of Revelation as a whole. That in and of itself is a very different way for us to approach the Bible for some of us. Many of us who read Revelation, we have no idea what to do with it. And some of us can tend to read it woodenly, or sometimes what people call literally, as they have seen it or heard it or watched it be interpreted by popular preachers, writers, and entertainment, movies, etc. But I want to talk about a few common mistakes that we can tend to make when we read Revelation, and what are some antidotes that help protect us from these types of mistakes. So the mistake number one, we fail to recognize Revelation's apocalyptic character, the genre of the literature, and the character and function of apocalyptic literature, why someone communicated in that literary genre at all. So when we fail to recognize this, it can lead to many problems for us. One antidote, one thing that can help us against this mistake, is to understand the features of apocalyptic literature, things such as symbolism, poetry, appeal to the imagination, etc. And I talked a little bit about this in our previous class last Sunday. And to also understand apocalyptic literature's function, that its goal is to provide comfort and challenge, hope and warning. Another mistake that we can tend to make is that we fail to take Revelation seriously as a product of and a message to its own time, meaning we can tend to pluck it out of its original context and look at it primarily and exclusively as only applying to our context, i.e. locusts mean attack Apache helicopters. That's not taking seriously the original context in which it was written. It could never have meant Apache helicopters to first century Mediterranean Eastern peoples. And so one of the antidotes that we can have to help us against this kind of mistake is to look, first of all, for clues to its meaning for late first century believers in Asia Minor. And in order to understand those clues, we have to do a lot of work, because late first century believers in Asia Minor is a long historical gap from us as 21st century American believers. And I've talked a bit at length on this in my How to Read the Bible class. How do we help shrink that historical distance gap? And the truth is it does take work. We've got to work at it and read and learn from others. So mistake three that I want to talk about is that we can postulate arbitrary contemporary fulfillment of apocalyptic symbols and visions, meaning that we can just kind of pull a rabbit out of a hat and say, oh, this must mean this in our day and time. The seven-headed dragon must mean, Donald Trump, because his name is 7 letters in this Sanskrit language. We just kind of pull things arbitrarily based on the wrong assumption that prophecy and history must be culminating right now in our present generation. And the truth is that every generation of Christians, there have been some who have felt like they were living in the present time culmination of prophecy and history, especially of the book of Revelation. And here we are 2,000 years later. Every generation of believers are going to have a subset of believers who view Revelation as being fulfilled in their generation. That fact in and of itself should give us pause. We're not the first generation to think that the Antichrist was in their generation, right? So one way that we can have an antidote against this type of reading and interpretive strategy with Revelation is to try to interpret Revelation symbols, first and foremost, within the first century rather than in the 21st century framework, and to look for its symbolically rich message that suggests contemporary analogous realities rather than literal specific future ones. Again, coming back to that lens area of the grid, to restate that, one way that helps us prevent against making arbitrary contemporary fulfillments that's happening in the book of Revelation right now is to try to understand how we can interpret Revelation symbolism within a first century context, i.e., how would John's readers and audience and listeners first have heard those symbols? How would they have understood it? And again, if you go back to my previous class, I have several tips on how to grow in understanding those things. And look for those meanings of symbols first before just plucking them out and trying to make them symbols for our realities. And then once we have a better grasp on what it probably would have meant for the first century audience, Now we can help take those understandings and see, is there anything analogous for the way they understood it for our current context and reality? A couple of other interpretive mistakes and antidotes that I want to mention. We could treat the Bible like a puzzle with pieces to be fit together. A text from here, a text from that book there, another one from here, and we put them together in order to figure out what kind of events are going to be coming. Again, it's kind of a piecemealed, arbitrary, a grab bag of just, hey, look, I made a mosaic. You know, it's like a Picasso around here with the Bible or something. But instead, an antidote is to read each biblical book, each book of the Bible, including Revelation, historically and contextually for its unique message. To read each book as a whole unit that has a message and a context, both in its original context and history and analogously for ours as well. This can help us have an antidote and kind of a vaccine for, if you will, not making some of these interpretive mistakes that many of us are very familiar with. One of the things that we're most known about Revelation is how it's been abused and how it's often misinterpreted. So how can we try to fight against that? I think these are some helpful things. Sometimes we can become preoccupied with questions about the meaning of certain unknowable or perhaps just less significant aspects of the book. Perhaps things like the beast or the Armageddon, etc. Or maybe a particular view about the millennium. And these things can tend to control how we read the entire book. So we become preoccupied with the wrong things. We major in the minors, as some might say. And an antidote is to instead maybe stay focused on the bigger thematic issues, to focus on the majors rather than on the disputed details, letting Revelation appeal to the disciplined, informed imagination about theological and spiritual matters and not treating it like an advanced DVD video of the future. Revelation is not meant to simply be a movie that we watch that displays how the end of the world is going to happen. And another mistake that we can make is that we fail to hear Revelation in light of the larger Christian tradition and contemporary scholarship. In other words, we're not allowing ourselves to be influenced by the witness of Christian history as well as contemporary Christian mindfulness and theology. And so often we can shut ourselves away from those types of voices, and that makes it more difficult for us to land in a faithful and more accurate interpretive strategy for Revelation. And so one way to help prevent us from this is to remember that contemporary people in our day, like Hal Lindsey, Tim LaHaye, Jerry Jenkins, David Jeremiah, these types of people are not the first, they're not the only, or necessarily the best interpreters of Revelation. And so as we try to understand Revelation, we got to remember what's the purpose of the book. And again, as I said last class, the purpose is not to predict the end of the world. The purpose of Revelation is to reveal truth about Jesus Christ to us. And in its original context, the purpose of Revelation was to persuade its hearers and its readers, both then and throughout all generations, to remain faithful to God in spite of the past, present, or possible future suffering. And I wanted to mention a few theological themes that you see when you read the book of Revelation. These are themes that are woven throughout the genre of literature that it's written in. The throne, you will see the throne come up over and over again. And it represents the reign of God and the reign of the Lamb that was slain. We see the theme of the reality of evil and of empire. We see the theme of the temptation for God's people towards idolatry and immorality. We see the theme of being called back to covenant faithfulness and resistance against those realities of evil and empire and idolatry and immorality. And if you're paying attention, you will see those very same themes all throughout the canon of Scripture, in particular in the prophetic works of the Old Testament. You see the theme of worship and an alternate vision of reality, of what is really real, what's really true. John presents these themes, an alternate vision of reality and truth than the world presents. There's the theme of faithful witness and the pattern of Christ, that Christ set forth a pattern. I believe there might be a misspelling there. I apologize. A pattern of Christ that he was faithful to the end, and he gave witness to God even in the midst of great trial and suffering. And there's a theme of us being called to be faithful witnesses like he was. And of course, there's the theme of the imminent judgment of God and the salvation and new creation of God, which is really the culmination of the entire meta narrative of the Bible. John, in Revelation 21 and 22, which we will get to at the end of this series, closes the narrative of God that started in Genesis 1 and 2 with a story of redeemed creation. A creation where humanity and God, where heaven and earth are joined perfectly once again as they were in the beginning of the story. And so I wanted to offer this summary statement of the book of Revelation. And this again is coming from Gorman, and I think it's helpful. A summary statement. How would you summarize Revelation in one sentence? I think that was one of the survey questions before we began this series together, is how would you summarize the book of Revelation in one sentence? I think this is a helpful one. It is uncivil worship, meaning opposed to civil worship, which also we're going to touch on next month. Uncivil worship and witness, following the Lamb out of fallen Babylon and into the new creation.